All right. So welcome everyone. It is our first She Conversation series for this year. So welcome whoever has joined online too. And as we start, we are on Gadigal land of Euro Nation. This land was never ceded. It holds stories, resistance, and sovereignty that no colonizer could erase. To name the First Nations people is not gesture, is of course, it is as a refusal to forget, a commitment to justice. So I honor Indigenous scholars, elders past and present, knowing that respect means unsettling, making space and doing the work whenever we want to stand in wherever we stand. So with that note, talking about institutional abandonment is like a way to unpack in the given crisis, whatever poly crisis we are living in. So I don't want to take much of introducing time. So let's just get to Oliver's talk.
Right, and I'm just going to let you know I'm going to wheelchair usage.
Okay, yeah.
Not this second.
Okay. Thanks, Polly. So should we wait for a person or should we just start with?
Not this second.
Not so you think so. Okay. Oliver, over to you.
Thanks very much for this kind introduction, and thanks very much for being here and having me at SHE. What I'm going to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so is a spin-off of a workshop Diego, I, and two colleagues from the Netherlands and Ukraine organized last year in Bielefeld. It had the long name States Manipulations of Belonging and Territoriality, Health Consequences and Activists' Intervention Strategies. We looked at how states use citizenship and borders to control and manipulate belonging. That means who belongs and who does not belong. And one of the questions that popped up was whether there's a continuum of such processes and what the underlying mechanisms are. So this is what started our discussion and work on abandonment, in particular institutional abandonment. Now, before I come to institutional abandonment, a few words on abandonment at individual level, because this is something we all can immediately connect to. Okay. Because it's almost primordial human fear being abandoned, especially, of course, among children. And this is why abandonment is such a common trope in fairy tales. I have two examples here, Hansel and Gretel, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, and The Ugly Duckling, Hans Christian Andersen, which already show elements of abandonment that we find in many other situations. So in Hansel and Gretel, what can be found in other cases of abandonment is the situation that two children are abandoned, go on a quest and manage to overcome the abandonment, regain power and agency. I'll come back to that later. And with The Ugly Duckling, remember this is the story where an egg of a swan ends up in the duck's nest. We don't know why, but the swan chick looks different from the other chicks, is constructed as being different, as being other, as being ugly. Again, that I will come back to that when I talk about the underlying mechanisms. So here is the overview of what is. Right, so I just started by saying a few words on individual level abandonment using two fairy tales as examples, trying to show that abandonment is a primordial human fear. But I'm now going to move to a different type of abandonment, which is institutional abandonment. In the next maybe 25 minutes or so, I'll first ask the question, can we use the term abandonment in a purely descriptive way, in a non-normative, value-free way? That is something Diego and I have been discussing. That would be nice, because then we would be able to distinguish between the act and its evaluation. I'm going to show that this is not possible. I will try to give you a definition of institutional abandonment, talk about the consequences and different degrees of severity of abandonment. And that is what I think is one of the important new aspects in this presentation. I will then talk about overcoming abandonment and why we are sometimes satisfied and sometimes not with attempts to overcome abandonment. And I'll conclude and talk about some unresolved issues. Now, you could think of abandoning an object as something rather neutral and value-free. However, we do not talk about abandoning a banana peel. We just drop it into the dustbin. As soon as it comes to an object with any kind of value, the act of abandonment is not free of moral or legal consequences. And a striking example is abandoning ship. You see here a photograph of the Costa Concordia disaster in 2012, when famously the captain slipped early during the evacuation procedures and fell into a lifeboat and left the scene of the disaster while there were still several hundred people on board. And this was a disaster or tragedy because 32 of those died. So on top of that, there are also legal consequences. As soon as a captain leaves the ship, the salvage rights are different. People can pick up the ship when it's in international waters. It's no longer belonging to the previous owner. So obviously, non-normative use is very difficult to envisage. Coming back to institutional abandonment and trying to give a definition here. Our working definition is institutional abandonment is the deliberate neglect of moral or legal obligations by an institution. In many of the examples, this is the state or certain sections of the state, towards a subgroup of its members, without this subgroup having legally severed ties or neglected their duties towards the institution in such a way that they can no longer rightfully claim protection. So this is a very extreme case, which I'm not going to look into here. So we are focusing on the deliberate neglect of moral or legal obligations by institutions towards a subgroup of its members. I'll come back to the definition at the end so we can then discuss it. This is based on certain premises, which I've tried to make transparent here. First of all, underlying is a contractual model of the state. Very simply, members give up liberties in exchange for protection. That's the very basic contractual model of the state. And Charles Tilly in 1991 actually described this nicely by saying subordinates, that means citizens of a state, actually get something in return for their subordination, something that is sufficient to make them acquiesce most of the time. So that's why people tolerate the state, but expect protection. The other underlying idea is one of cooperative government, but that actually is with the view that a government is constantly at risk of lapsing into or towards extractive government. So I see this as a kind of scale. An ideal government would be cooperative, but there's a strong tendency of moving towards extractive government. Again, I will come back to that a bit later. Abandonment would then be a tangible consequence of institutional failure to protect adequately, and often this is inherent part of a lapse towards extractive government. Consequences of institutional abandonment. Just very briefly, I'm not going to cover this in any detail today. Reduced physical health or death, think of the sinking ship. Reduced mental health, financial or economic loss, cultural loss, misrecognition of subgroups of the population. And here we realize that abandonment is a kind of umbrella term because it links harms and their cause. Again, something I will come back to at the end of this presentation. My last slide full of text. Here is the rationalization of abandonment. When institutions abandon population subgroups in a cooperative state, they knowingly or intentionally neglect their obligations, so they need to rationalize their act. This is before the Musk-Trump administration, where this seems no longer necessary. A decisive step in rationalizing abandonment is the institutions explicitly or implicitly defining the respective population subgroup as different, as other, as non-deserving. Think of the example of the ugly duckling. So this is often based on a discourse which has historical roots, or which often has historical roots, and which persists because of a power imbalance between institution and abandoned population subgroup. So we call this othering of the respective group. The idea that we have been discussing recently is that there is almost a graded scale of increasing grades of neglect. So it's not always an extreme form of abandonment, but there are less extreme forms. And what we are discussing is whether this is actually a continuum, or what I show you here on the list are separate entities. Now, our idea is that this is actually a scale of increasing grades, starting with a failure to act on behalf of a population subgroup, which could be called negligence. Then more severe willful default of duties towards a population subgroup. Even more severe than that, active exclusion of a population subgroup from institutional benefits and services. And even more severe, expulsion of a population subgroup from the institution, for example, by revoking citizenship. So the idea here, or the discussion we can later have, is this actually a scale, or is this completely different from the other points here? Having said that, there is clearly a point where, well, there has to be a point where an act does not constitute abandonment. So we sometimes somehow have to draw a line between what is not abandonment and what is abandonment, which is very difficult. But I'll give you one popular culture example that maybe shows what is not abandonment. If you watch this movie again over Christmas, Home Alone, when Kevin's family left for vacation, they forgot one minor detail, Kevin. Now this is, in my view, not an act of abandonment, because it was not done intentionally. It was not in a situation where the perpetrators, in inverted commas, the parents, did not try to repair the situation. They actually did. It does, however, contain the other usual elements of abandonment, or frequent elements of abandonment, namely the quest. Kevin going on a quest to resolve the situation. Let me move on to overcoming abandonment. And we are intuitively satisfied with two major ways of overcoming abandonment. One is an innocent victim regains power and agency, often after a successful quest. Frequently, we see that in fairy tales. Second, intuitively satisfying outcome, we have a bad guy perpetrator, and this bad guy perpetrator is punished. And number three, a combination of one and two, which is excessively rare in real life situation. What is also rare in real life situations is that the moral status is so clear as in, let's say, fairy tales, but there are good guys and bad guys. And the other problem in real life is that overcoming abandonment often requires substantial shifts in structural and discursive power. Again, I'll show an example for that. So the easy and satisfying solutions are rather the exception. Now here, we were at least legally and morally satisfied because the captain who abandoned his ship before the passengers was publicly reviled because he was not the last to leave the ship. And there were many other elements which were used in the press and public discussion to kind of prove that he was really a bad guy. So allegedly, his dancer girlfriend was on the bridge. He was a married man while the accident happened. So the question was, did he want to show off to his girlfriend and whatnot? He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. So we have here the solution that there was punishment. Of course, that doesn't help the 32 people who perished in the disaster. So here it was easy to construct an entirely bad person from the perspective of the public, who expects Chesney Sullenberger, remember that pilot who saved all the passengers of the plane, which had to go down on the Hudson River. So that's how the public expects a captain to be. He was constructed as a bad person from a legal perspective because of the salvage rights, of course, from the point of view of the cruise ship industry. In most other situations, it's far more ambiguous. So Priya helped me with this example here of a motorcyclist who allegedly observed abandonment. What you see here is a photograph from a surveillance camera at a petrol station. And the driver of this vehicle rushed inside the petrol station to grab some water, while his 5-year-old son was still in the car. And the gentleman pictured below here saw this as an issue of child abandonment, left his motorcycle, jumped into the car, and drove off to the nearest police station. So here we have a problem. Is this actually an issue of abandonment? And if it is the intervention a legitimate one or an illegitimate one? Is this merely a misuse of situational power by the person here? And there was certainly no agency or power reinstated, in particular not for the child, which was under the impression of being abducted, whether rightly or wrongly, we don't know. So real life situations tend to be much more ambiguous. Ed Gazzotti actually provided another example here of inappropriate responses. And this is the story of Little Barry Bilby's Big Bush Band, which is book for children, And little Barry Bilby needs to get his Aussie animal bandmates back together so they can save Platypus's school from closing down. So we're talking about a rural school that is being closed due to lack of resources. If little Barry Bilby's big bush band can win the Tangalanga Talent Quest, they can use the Golden Gum Nut Prize to save the school. So we have here an example where the quest actually goes in a direction that we would conceive as being wrong, because it is not the pupils who are supposed to provide funding for a school, but the government. And this book sends dubious message to the children who read it. But again, what you can see is that not all responses to abandonment are clearly the right ones. My final example draws together several aspects of institutional abandonment, and that is the horrific story of Grenfell Tower. You may remember that there was a fire in this residential tower in 2017, in which 72 people perished. Now, this tower is a 24-story residential tower block with 127 flats in one of the richest boroughs of London, but it is a social for people who are socially disadvantaged. It was built in 1972 to 74, and it actually was renovated in 2016 with new outside cladding, because the tower looked so unpleasant. So the new cladding was shiny, but it turned out it was not fireproof. The report on the disaster focused entirely on the technical issues. How is it that aluminum plus certain material can burn, rather than the underlying causes? And this was that social welfare was in the UK seen as something that had to be provided at least partly by private companies. So it had to be a profitable business, and there was no clear-cut decision who was responsible to ensuring that the cladding was actually fireproof. So in the end, the cheapest cladding was bought, and by saving like 200,000 British pounds, the disaster was made possible. So here, the report on the disaster, the apparent assignment of responsibility left out the part of the population group that was affected by this disaster. People with a darker skin, people with a lower socioeconomic status, and focused entirely on technicalities, also leaving out the underlying political decisions. So to sum up, here is again the definition: institutional abandonment, the deliberate neglect of moral or legal obligations by an institution towards a subgroup of its members, without this subgroup having legally severed ties. I showed you the innovation in this talk, the different degrees of severity. And here are the conclusions. The concept comprises the concept of institutional abandonment, comprises the causes of the causes. That is an advantage when it comes to assigning responsibility. If one would have conceived the Grenfell Tower disaster as an act of abandonment, then the focus would probably or hopefully not have been on the fireproofness of material. Comprising the causes of causes means comprising also exclusionary or including exclusionary practices, power imbalances, and thereby moving beyond legal determinants of health, which of course play a role, but are not the only aspect here, and moral obligations. I have tried to show you that there are similarities between ostensibly different scenarios. I haven't gone into more extreme examples of institutional abandonment, such as withdrawing citizenship, but the concept as such allows to discuss these acts as similar. Real life or moral or real life legal statuses or obligations are often less clear-cut than we would wish. This is one of the shortcomings or one of the limitations, I should say, of this concept. We are still struggling to resolve the issue of process of abandonment versus outcome of abandonment. So are we talking about the process, or are we talking about a population group being or having been abandoned? And we are still struggling to resolve the role of othering versus abandonment. Is othering the process and abandonment the outcome? That is presently my preference, but Diego may see it differently. We are currently discussing or struggling with this one. That was my short introduction into abandonment and institutional abandonment, and you're most welcome to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Oliver. So questions, just please raise a hand, Mark. Okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
So my background is in disability. I'm director of the Centre for Disability Research and Policy, and I've spent 4 years at Australia's Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with disabilities. So, so lots of sort of alignments in what we're talking about. I don't like the word deliberate, and I wonder whether that needs nuance. So, when I think of probably the sort of primary driver of violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation is ableism, which is a word that it does include explicit or deliberate sort of hatred of people with disability, but more often it's implicit and subtle and not deliberate. It comes from, I guess, paternalism and assumptions. So there's the sort of basic idea of ableism is that people with disability are different from, less than, other, so it's that form of othering, and then a burden that becomes sort of as part of it. And so it drives often well-meaning but paternalistic behaviours that shape violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So yes, I don't like that word deliberate, because I think abandonment, or maybe then abandonment's not right, but maybe it just drives neglect, comes from seemingly well-meaning decisions that have abandonment consequences. And in disability history, that's been primarily in the segregation, the exclusion and segregation of people with disabilities. So the exclusion is, a struggle to get into disability. Now, we managed it because fortunately they fixed that problem, but it wasn't straightforward. But there's still many ways in which people with disability are excluded, whether that's neglect or abandonment, maybe you could speak to. And then segregation was the other one, where we put people with disability in spaces that, segregated schools or institutions, etc. So I don't know whether we're calling that neglect or abandonment, how that fits on your scale. But anyway, it's certainly a really interesting sort of field of study that relates to that. So I'll just leave you to respond to that in various ways.
Thanks very, very much. That is an excellent point, or these are excellent points. And I realize that the word deliberate in the definition is not in line with the scale, which actually has as the lowest degree of abandonment, a failure to act on behalf of a population group, negligence. So we need to think about the terminology deliberate here. It's a very good point. Thank you.
We'll take Camilla.
Hello, Oliver. Hello, welcome back to Australia.
Thank you,
I
Camilla.
enjoyed your presentation very much, but I was surprised not to hear the term rights and responsibilities. And I'm assuming that was deliberate. To me, if somebody has responsibility, be that moral or legal responsibility, only then can they be accused of abandonment. Is that what you would agree as well?
Yes. I used the word moral or legal obligations. And maybe that is because I'm a public health person, not an ethic person trained in ethics. And I will see whether whether that means the same or something different. So I've taken note of that.
Actually, my question was very similar to his, which was, what are your thoughts on the difference between abandonment and neglect? And abandonment feels a little bit more lenient, but maybe what they're actually trying to do is neglect. So intentionally neglect certain aspects as opposed to abandonment. That we intended to do it, but oops, it didn't happen, so we have to abandon it. But we just want your thoughts on that. So maybe it's a semantics thing, and I'm just.
I'm not sure whether I got your question correctly. You make abandonment sound as something harmless in comparison to neglect.
No.
Okay, then I'm.
Maybe
Yeah.
it is, but just your thoughts on the difference between what you think is the difference between abandonment and neglect when it comes to the context in which.
Well, the idea was to have a scale and to have neglect as the weakest form of abandonment, and have the exclusion from an institution as the strongest form. But I would actually challenge a position or a use of the term abandonment in a way that makes it sound like you're abandoning an object, like similar to dropping the banana peel into the dustbin. I think it is you abandon an idea, but only if that idea has a certain value to you. So you have invested time, energy, thought, discussion into that idea. So I think it's a term that is inherently value-laden and or normative.
Thanks, Oliver. I agree with what you just said about the term abandonment. I think it's a big concept. And I was also picking up on what some other people were picking up on. Your definition has it being intentional. And it made me think about the difference between maybe de jure instances of abandonment. And because I'm somewhat, I've talked to Diego a little bit, I've talked to you a little bit, I kind of know some of the ideas that you're talking about. So the ship example is a clear one where it was an intentional decision that the captain made to step away from his duties. And if the government did that the way they did in COVID-19 by saying that people who'd gone to part of the world could not then return to Australia, that's a de jure, like they've actually made a policy decision in that moment. But perhaps connected to what Mark said, there's all kinds of de facto abandonment, or and it may happen more gradually, and it may happen without anyone actually really ever intending it. And I was thinking about the way that towns may get abandoned. You might say that Detroit has been largely abandoned, or parts of rural Australia have been abandoned. And it's while in some sense you could still point your finger and say the government did it. Then I asked, well, like, who do you mean by the government? Who's the agent that you then mean. So I guess I'm just wondering if there's room in your definition of abandonment to maybe change, I don't know, change or expand it from being only intentional to maybe also being like the unintended but cumulative results of numerous different
Yeah.
factors, some of which may not be governmental, some of which may be economic or environmental, and ultimately individual.
Again, we take note of that. I think Diego already scribbled something in his notebook. I think that's a good point. I mean, even the term deliberate in the context of the Costa Concordia disaster is difficult to uphold once you look into the full story with that captain sitting on the beach and crying. So, I mean, apparently he was not able to act as he should have acted. And the bad guy the bad guy image kind of starts falling apart in that situation. Yes, we need to be careful. I need to be careful with the term deliberate that comes across again. And what I left out here is a look at various dictionary definitions of abandonment. I think it is possible to focus on certain meanings of abandonment and trying to leave out the other meanings by actively saying, this is what we mean, and this is what we wish to exclude here, because it is a term that has so many meanings or can be interpreted in so many ways.
I just am following up on this as I'm thinking about othering and also the questions of abandonment, which is, so as Kate said, thick concept. But I'm wondering whether neglect, going back to the definition, I'm sorry about picking on that too. Is it neglect is so depoliticized way of talking about this? I feel rather, how do you think about exclusion? I mean, the moment we talk about exclusion, then it retains the, of course, it's value not matter. I mean, the whole is value dependent or value latent. That means how do you account for the exclusionary, which you also mentioned about exclusionary practices? Then what's the difference between an exclusion and any other concept? So then it's completely context dependent, as you're rightly also pointing out. So I'm just clarifying with you why neglect. Should we even leave out the neglect aspect or talk more about exclusion? And does it make any sense when we talk about abandonment? Then?
Would a term like non-fulfillment instead of neglect resolve that problem? Or are you arguing that we have constructed something here which is not sufficiently different from othering? This is an issue that Diego and I have been discussing repeatedly without having come to, my last slide is no longer here, without having come to a solution.
Yeah, I mean, othering is always context dependent with which context, for example, with racial group, as you mentioned, subgroups. So again, which country, which historical time period. So all those plays out so much significant when we are trying to see it as an abandonment, or the other example, like when the Australian citizens were abandoned, but it's a policy decision again. So yeah, no, those questions are definitely based on. I'll take this question. Is it a follow-up?
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh, mine follows very closely to yours, so it'll.
Sure. Okay, let's move on.
So I'm just still playing around with the terms abandonment, neglect. By the way, I like the othering leading to whether it's neglect or abandonment, because othering is what's driving the abandonment. So we start off by we don't think of the person as fully human, and then that leads to the action. So in my view, there's a strong case for that. So I would agree there. But I'm struggling. Is abandonment, is this a formal term? This is the first time I've really seen this as a formal term. Like, is there a history in the philosophical literature of this term, or is this a term you've chosen? Just because, I don't know, I feel sometimes that it's actually not as strong as the word neglect, which feels, because the subtleties of neglect, there's more you can do with it. And with your town one, I was really interested in the town image, because sometimes we abandon a town because its time is up, the world's moved on, and there's not always a value laden judgment. So I don't know about this scale from neglect to abandonment, as though abandonment is somehow worse than neglect, because I'm not quite sure I see it that way. But yeah.
When I started to think about it, I hadn't retrieved the amount of literature that I have since. And there is a whole book on abandonment, which very heavily focuses on psychoanalytical aspects of abandonment. So it's all about this primordial fear and the consequences in terms of health and whatnot. Actually, it brings together the psychoanalytic and some political views. There's another paper I came across recently, which actually conceives the Grenfell Tower disaster as an act of abandonment. So very much in line with what I've been presenting here. I don't remember the authors is in it. So yes, the concept is being used, not very commonly. And I'll think about it, whether it is really stronger than neglect. If it comes to abandonment in the strongest sense, which again, I have not presented here today, but which was one of the important points in our workshop, I think it is stronger because it is the active exclusion of people from an institution. And we had historical examples like political opponents, Jewish people being kicked out of Germany by withdrawing their passport. Retrospectively, those were the lucky ones, but it is more than negligence or neglect, sorry, more than neglect or stronger than neglect.
We'll take one from online and one. Yeah. Emily, I think you raised first.
Hi, can I speak? Yeah, I was just wondering whether it's the emotional content of the word itself. And this will be, I suspect, a subjective thing, and each of us might interpret these things differently. But neglect to me sounds more malignant than abandonment. So a more active role rather than just discarding. Neglect is where you have intention for there to be potential damage. That's I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
It is clearly an issue. And as I just said, my examples of abandonment that I've been looking at, to me, seemed emotionally stronger than, I'm inclined to say mere neglect. Sorry, but this is not a good way to put it. But we have to overcome this by being clear in the definition. I think that's the only way to do it. We all attach some value or meaning to words, and by trying to be clear what we mean and what we don't mean, we can only just do our best trying to overcome this.
Yeah, so clear definitions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
I've spent the last 10 years out of the formal ethics space on the front line as disability advocate, 4 of which was helping people who spent their early life in large residential institutions make direct submissions to the Royal Commission. Some of them even went on to be public witnesses. So that's the headspace I'm in. The term abandonment carries so much more weight than neglect in terms of emotionally resonating with the experience of this cohort, many of whom communicate informally in other ways. And I think it's because neglect has a much tighter line of cause and effect to me. That's the sort of subtext of it. You can draw a legal line of negligence, and what the people I have been supporting have experienced, you can't draw that line directly. We cannot hold any one actor responsible for that neglect. But like the example of Grenfell, where you've got the cost-saving mechanisms and the profitability of welfare systems, I can trace a line. The Richmond report, for all of its recommendations around deinstitutionalisation, was actually used to justify cost-cutting measures in the way it was enacted. And several generations of change on, we have a cohort of people that government departments are embarrassed to acknowledge even exist. When we try and advocate to have a history of institutionalised upbringing recognised as a statistic, the answer we get from the Department of Social Services is, oh, people don't like to talk about that. It's a bit icky. And so abandonment encapsulates that kind of really nebulous stuff that's much harder to measure and much harder to hold accountable, but the impact of that is phenomenal on people's lives. So yeah, I popped back in for my first formal ethics thing in over 10 years because that term resonated with the lived experience of people who share.
Sorry, is the follow-up or is it? Yeah. Emily?
Hi, thanks everyone. Thank you. This is great. One of the things in listening and thinking about this, I've been enjoying the consideration of scale, and that this isn't just, I personally feel the neglect to exclusion is a reasonable scale within an umbrella of consideration of abandonment. But I'm trying to recognize voices, but the suggestion of intention and that scale as well, I think you're dealing potentially with a number of not only parallel but perpendicular scales that influence this thought. And one of the other pieces that seems to be coming in from the voices is the emotion space. And while it's really hard, I challenge the thought of removing emotion from this, because often it's the decisions that result in, whether they're intentional or not, may not always be emotionally informed or influenced. And so I guess I'm wondering, maybe there's a space for considering what is the catalyst that leads to, was it an emotional space? And an example I've mentioned to you and thought about in this has been the closure of maternity wards across the rural and remote spaces, thereby leaving quite a few women abandoned in their healthcare and choices for how they bring a child into the world. And an aside note, I don't know if those in the room can see the chat, and I realized it probably isn't helpful giving it to everybody else, but whoever was just speaking about institutionalization, you may be, this is a really far aside, I apologize to everyone, but you may be interested that there's a 100 years anniversary activity for recognizing Bloomfield and the institution out here in Orange that was established. And that may be of interest to you. I don't know who that was. Sorry for that very far aside comment.
No, thank you very much. I think that relates to these very important points that came out in the discussion. So thanks, Emily.
So actually, in this talk, we've had chats, and one thing I've been thinking about, which is sort of related to some theories that I've been exploring, is that abandonment might seem to be sort of an outcome rather than the driver or the actual problem, where institutions that are set up, and how they're funded, how they're constructed, is about the conditional inclusion, where the conditions are toxic into lives, toxic or playing role, being part of that power structure. And otherwise, it's about control over the working class, control over illness, to protect the society, the privileged class wants. And so those sort of services and inclusion in the institutions is only done insofar as it needs to be done to protect power. And only then, and if it seems that that's not going to be an issue, if you make it to the next election without providing your services, then it's not. So, for example, you know, what about psychiatry? Quick and past couple of bills overpaid and conditions. And the government had to come to the table on negotiations because public psychiatric mental health isn't for the privileged class, because people can afford their own. It's mainly to others. Systems available to so that people who come into emergency departments with issues can be dealt with, and even the Premier understand that the reason the big problem was think about the police and the corrections officers have to deal with these people. That's the problem, rather than people themselves. So yeah, so speaking of the selective inclusion and the interests of power rather than abandonment is just the outcome. They were never included in good faith.
I think that matches with a lot of what I've been saying. Seeing abandonment as the outcome of a process in which, here in my presentation, I related to othering. You also mentioned government's attempts to find out how far can they move from a cooperative to an extractive government by keeping money away from social services. Well, people here are familiar with the Barry Bilby story, which you introduced me to. So that could, of course, also be conceived as an example for what you've just been saying, withdrawing funding from a rural school and seeing whether people are able to resolve the problem on their own. That means money saved.
Hi everyone, my name is Amy Sylvia. Thank you so much, Oliver. It was a really interesting talk, especially for someone like me who doesn't think about this at all really in the context of their daily work. So it's really educational as well. I had a little kind of thought to lob into the discussion that's been happening around negligence, abandonment, and then a really gigantic, big picture, high level question. So we'll see how that goes. But my thought about the negligence abandonment thing is really just to flag, as I'm sure you know, that both of these terms have really specific meanings in law. And actually, I think it would be worth you, when you write about this, to kind of be explicit about that and upfront, particularly because abandonment is pretty benign in law. Like it's kind of sort of a bit like walking away from something, putting it down deliberately without any further feeling that attention is needed to it. And it usually happens in things like property law or contract law, where you write in an abandonment clause into a contract, so if someone is deemed to have not looked at it for a certain period of time, it's deemed to have been abandoned. And in property, it's this idea that you're giving up the right to something. But I know that's not what you mean at all. And I think I'm really intrigued and interested in this whole discussion that's been happening around which of these terms is the more severe or which one is worse. And for what it's worth, I feel like abandonment has more scope when we're talking about things like government, because I'm legally trained, and so my brain with negligence goes to the very kind of well-defined and very specific and often hard to meet standard to prove that.
Whereas abandonment, I think, offers us a lot more juicy wiggle room for really nuanced discussion, which leads me to my big question. So this semester, I'm contributing to a unit of study that is teaching students about public health ethics when they've never come across it before. And so I've been looking at lots of really high level ideas and papers about the area, just to recommend things for the students to read. And so with my head in that space of high level approaches in public health ethics and thinking about the ways of thinking and the key concepts that are in the field as we know it, do you see ideas about abandonment actually going in at that very high level to be an extra way of thinking in public health ethics more generally? And I guess if you do, are there particular problems, besides the ones you've talked about, of course, where this concept could actually enrich or better nuanced debate in comparison to how it's gone up until now?
That to me sounds like a question best answered by the abstract Diego sent in yesterday. What are the global health? What are the global health implications of the concept of abandonment? In what respect does it help? It is a work in progress.
Do you want to give us your 5-second thoughts, Diego?
So the 5-second thought, I guess.
Oh, sorry.
So Oliver and I are working on many things with regards to this idea, and one of it is what is the explanatory value, and does it allow us to identify nuances of wrongs that we don't normally capture with other normative architecture that we currently have? And given the work that Oliver and I do, global health is front and center. So I don't think it has been used a lot it is in the legal field, absolutely. So when I've had conversations with lawyers, they're like, no shit. And then, but outside of it, I think it's much less so. So that's a 10-second lead.
Can you hear me? Hi, everyone, it's Claire. And it was just mild extensions of the conversation that's developed out of this. It's been a lovely conversation apart from anything else. And it's turns on, it's familiar to both of you as my general orientation to a preference for discussing things in terms of systems rather than individualized. And I felt like that's where this conversation has gone, moved away from deliberate and intentional, or what those things mean when we're talking about systems and how systems work. And then that implies perhaps slightly more complicated line of argument around process, because systems tend to suggest dynamics that can produce conditions that you're going to label as abandonment, some specific and directly malevolent, and some less specific and directly malevolent. And that just might add a bit more complexity. And it might end up that your scales, I mean, they're always artificial, aren't they? And they're there for a function. And the chief problem with them is that they then quickly become things where you go, actually, it doesn't work in the following circumstances. So trying to say that abandonment is sort of the worst version of neglect, just maybe one of them shouldn't be worse than the other. Or maybe they should be worse in a context, but not outside that context where they have really specified meanings. So these contexts are really specified contexts for reasons that you set out really eloquently. But in other contexts, maybe they don't work in that relation to each other. It's kind of that contextual line was quite focused. And hence, some of the way of looking at that. Yeah. I don't know.
Thank you. Did you want to say? No. Okay. This is Kate. And thank you for giving me a second question. This question is about a very tiny thing you said about social contract. So your model is based on the idea of a social contract. Which I think is a useful myth in political theory, depending on what you're doing. And so I guess I wanted to ask you or press you to think whether or not it's a useful myth for you. It is a useful myth if you're thinking about freely contracting parties with rights and obligations that they exchange. And you might think that that's a useful myth when we're talking about immigration. So I asked Australia for certain things when I came here, and they asked me to provide certain guarantees, etc. However, in the place where I was born, no such agreement was ever made. And that actually connects to the stuff you started this talk with about children and family and psychoanalysis and the deep feelings of abandonment, where actually abandonment is about kinship and family and being left by the people who are really supposed to be your last line, something like that. They're the people who are supposed to be there for you besides everybody else, or something like that. So it's like, if Australia deports me, well, that's one thing. If Canada abandons me, I'm stateless. There's something like way bigger. I mean, so that's blending together this like legal idea, but also something deep in my identity that is very difficult to articulate. But, and I again come back to the idea of when Australia said these people can't come back during the pandemic, it's like that was a function of their othering and this kind of connection that you're making to belonging and processes of othering and things like that at the end. So I think I'm not sure that social contract is exactly the right thing, or it's a blend of social contract plus family.
Because of the key of what you were talking about also is that concept of attachment.
Yeah.
And how
Sorry,
profoundly abandoned it is through it.
Oh, well, we can all be.
Oh, yeah, I was just, sorry, I was just commenting that I love what Kate says, because at the heart of the sort of psychoanalytic beginning of this, and then of the context of people who have lived in institutionalized circumstances, is that notion of attachment and how profoundly harmful, disturbing that attachment is, and that goes beyond any of those approaches.
Thank you. I can't stop after this discussion to just point out my thoughts on rationalizing. You mentioned something about rationalizing abandonment. And I feel you can't rationalize because othering is a prior to the abandonment. I mean, that kind of, so it's a very structure of the system which leads to, just had a thought. Because it functions, right? It's not, it's a very structures of the way the power works, especially when you want to abandon a certain subgroup. Again, what subgroups mean. So how do you rationalize that? That's what I was wondering. Yeah, anyway. Well, we are all. Oh, there is a last question. Should we? Okay. Andrew, quick question.
Yes, I wonder if abandonment is ongoing, because within the disability field, we've had deinstitutionalization and inclusion in society of people with disabilities. But the very presence of, while you have lived in an institution and being integrated back into integrated into a community, you've still been abandoned regardless of the fact that you've been integrated into your community. So I wonder if it's not a temporal space in time, but an ongoing issue over a lifespan.
Maybe not. Andrew, we are so sorry. We couldn't hear because of the speaker issue here in the room. Unfortunately. Do you want to? No, we couldn't pick up, right?
I couldn't.
So if Andrew wants to send it to me, I can send it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Please reach out to Oliver or even to Diego, right? Yeah.
Tell him.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you so much. This was really rich. We had fun, and there's more to think and talk more.
And thanks to
Yeah,
all of you,
thank you.
for the discussion today, but also for many discussions in past weeks and months. This was really, really helpful. And sorry if I missed out. You made that point about kinship before. I missed that out in my presentation here. Make sure I think about it again. Thank you very,
Thank
very
you.
much.